in professional development for artists as a lecturer and workshop leader and coach. And her labor and vision has been instrumental in making the fellowship what it is today. So please welcome Ella Troiano, who will introduce our fellows and also introduce the wonderful Legacy Russell, who we are so happy to have here today. Thank you, Ella.
Thank you so much, Samatina. Thank you. I am so excited about tonight. I'm excited to meet Legacy Russell, and I'll tell you a little bit more about her. Legacy Russell is a curator and writer, born and raised in New York City. She is the Associate Curator of Exhibitions at the Studio Museum in Harlem. Russell holds a Master's of Research with distinction in art history from Goldsmiths, University of London, with a focus in visual culture. Her academic, curatorial, and creative work focuses on gender, performance, digital selfdom, internet idolatry, and new media ritual. Russell's written work, interviews, and essays have been published internationally. She is a recipient of the Thoma Foundation 2019 Arts Writing Award in Digital Art and a 2020 Rauschenberg Residency Fellow. Her first book, Glitch Feminism, a manifesto from 2020, is published by Verso Books. Gives me great pleasure to introduce Legacy, who will introduce the rest of the fellows. And I will see you a little bit later after the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Stamatina and Ella, for having me, and of course, most especially to these incredible fellows, Muse, Dodd, Stefa, Alarcon, and Heather Lynn Johnson. It's really exciting to be here with all of you today. We're going to actually open the evening with the presentation of Heather first. And as we go through, I'll be sharing out some bios. I'll put them in the chat as well, if that is useful for folks. But, you know, I'm just so thrilled and excited to be here marking this, you know, really major kind of turning point in terms of the arc of this fellowship. And as Stamatina said, in a very challenging period of time. So major props to all. So first up with Heather. Heather Lynn Johnson is an artist and poet living in Brooklyn. She is the author of The Survival Guide for Queer Black Youth, Inpatient Press 2017, and the 2017 Literary Fellow for the Queer Art Mentorship Program. Heather's work is characterized by its lyricism and cultural critique. Her formal approach to the narrative, whether visual or poetic, is distinguished by her willingness to lay bare her own existence. Heather received an MFA from the Rhode Island School of Design. Her artwork and poetry is in the collections at the Whitney Museum of American Art, and she has received an International Photography Lucy Award. Heather's art has been exhibited internationally and most notably at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Currently, she is painting self-studies for her After Basquiat and Icon series while working on her next book of poetry, I Owe You Nothing, How to Be Black and Free. You can follow Heather on Instagram at HeatherJmet. Welcome, Heather.
Hi, thanks Legacy so much for that introduction. And I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. Let's see. All right. Okay. Good evening. My name is Heather Lynn Johnson. I'm a painter, poet, and photographer, and I'm thrilled to be kicking off the festivities tonight. First, I want to thank Leslie-Lohman Museum, specifically Stamatina Gregory and Nirvana Santos for putting this panel together. Ella Troiano and Eliza Schwartz for their guidance and scholarship this year. Legacy Russell, who's absolutely an amazing curator, superstar, and a writer, for agreeing to moderate and steer this discussion tonight. Muse and Stefa, who I'm so honored to be sharing screen time with, and all of the 2019-2020 fellows whose advice and generosity of spirit I couldn't say enough about. This is a photograph of me at 8 years old, and also the cover photo for my poetry book, A Survival Guide for Queer Black Youth. published by Impatient Press in 2017. That book of poetry was made during my mentorship with Pamela Sneed for the Career Arts Mentorship Program and is now in its third printing. This is a photo of one of my survival tips from the book installed at a cafe in Antwerp's Queer Art Festival in Belgium. The impetus for these poems can be found on the second page of the book, which reads, "I'm writing this as one colored queer to another, a guide to help you along so when the time comes and you have to coon, jive, and dip, you will know how to keep that small voice inside of you alive. Give no more fucks and bounce. We are not dead, but sometimes it feels like it." This is the first poem in my book. America is obsessed with niggers, forever hung around our necks. This noose will not be the death of us. Which brings me to this project called Reparations, which I made in 2005. These digital collages became negatives and then printed on aluminum using liquid photo emulsion. The photographs are from the W.E.B. Du Bois Archive, Types of American Negroes, Georgia, collected for the 1900 Paris Exposition World Fair. I wanted to open with these photo collages because I would describe this project as my origin point when I first became interested in visualizing the weight of Blackness and the responsibility I carried from generations of silenced voices. Collage became a visual language for me to describe how the Black body is not a neutral space, how I was rendered both hypervisible and invisible at the same time. This project was made in 2016 and is called I Hate the Way You Love Me, where I collage photographs taken from the Alan Lomax archive at the American Folklife Center's ethnographic research on traditional folk singers and musicians. This project was printed really large at about 70 inches by like 45 inches. I was making work as a love letter to Blackness in a world that only sees dark skin as a violent place. Much like my poetry, my work is layered with historical references and my personal experience. 5 years prior, I made this project. 5 years prior to the previous project, I made this project called 99.9% Black. I found celebrity headshots from the internet and darkened their skin to 99.9% Black pigment to reflect the lack of darker skinned role models in my youth, the one drop rule from miscegenation laws, and to look at colorism in Hollywood. This project was also printed really large. Oprah was about billboard size, but I also did like 50 inches by 40 inches. This theme of double consciousness, erasure, and visibility runs throughout my process, whether I'm collaging or painting. I am currently working on a series called Icons. That picture previously was Madonna with Child. And this is a Civil War veteran. It's fairly new series in which I'm looking at religious iconography from medieval times to the Italian Renaissance and making it as queer and Black as possible using archival photographs. And I'll end on my After Basquiat self-portrait series, where I recreate figures from his paintings and recontextualize them as butch Black lesbians, who we have always been left out of the canonical and modern painting lexicon. And this work is meant to challenge an enduring visual history of racist and homophobic taxonomy and the continued refusal to see me. And as I move forward in this process, my work goes between the figurative and the more abstract. This painting is called A Handsome Woman. And as I continue to play with language and the visual, it becomes more interesting to look at how gender plays a role when you just reduce it to shapes. Thank you so much for allowing me to present tonight, and I look forward to your questions. And if anyone wants to contact me, my website is hljohnson.com. All right, stop share.
Thank you so much, Heather. I'm so excited to dive into this conversation as we unfold across all of our incredible fellows. I have put Heather's bio in the chat for those who are looking for her website, and we are going to now pivot to our next presenter, Stefa Marin Alarcon. So Stefa, are you there? Yes. Great. So Stefa, I'm going to just quickly present, a little bio. Using an amalgamation of punk, experimental, pop, and classical minimalism, Stefa builds worlds that offer a somatic, decolonial respite for the displaced in search of home. Stefa has shared their work, spirit, song with Queens Museum, Brooklyn Museum, Museo del Barrio, National Sawdust, BAD, Nuevo Fest, Tulsa Artist Residency, Cine Las Americas, Body Hack, Fierce Futures, and many more. They studied Eurocentric classical music for 20 years, where they also were an artist in resident at Truque Residencia Artística, Slippage Residency at Duke University, and a Hemispheric Institute of Performance and Politics Emerge NYC Fellow in 2019. Please join me in welcoming Stefa, and you can follow Stefa along on Instagram at Stefa Lives.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and to Legacy for leading this conversation tonight. Good evening, everyone. My name is Stefa Marin Alarcon, and I am a vocalist, composer, and multimedia performance artist born and raised in Queens, New York. I create work that offers visual and sonic medicine for the misfits, the displaced, the sensitive freaks, a collective coming together, yearning for a sense of home. I make music for the revolution. Wink. This image is the cover art for, This image is the cover art for my record Cepalina, released on Figure and Ground Records in 2018. I composed, performed, and co-produced 6 tracks, queering classical forms with punk aesthetics, indigenous chants, and conceptual pop art influences to create a genreless sonic journey of my personal revolution.
Cepalina way, Cepalina way, eba doa doa de, eba doa doa de. Cepalina way, Cepalina way,
Cepalina, co-directed by myself and collaborator Cristóbal Guerra Naranjo, follows native alien who wakes up on the shores of an unfamiliar land, stripped of their language and memories. A metaphor for my own feelings of displacement, first-generational non-belonging, ni de aquí ni de allá, from neither here nor there. Creating Cepalina was about confronting my classical music training, the lack of indigenous music passed down to me, and about my voice and body as a vessel for liberation. I was curious to know what existed beyond the language of my colonizers, English, Spanish. I found a medicine song from the Emberajami, an indigenous community I was told my grandmother was from, and transcribed it into a choral arrangement for my voice. I didn't know what the words meant, but I was interested in feeling them in my mouth and body as a way of returning and creating these sonic histories for myself. This is a page from Return to Earth, Volver a la Tierra, a take-home visual score made up of lyrics and translations family photos and self-portraits that I created for a performance of the same name at Brooklyn Museum's Radical Women in Latin America performance series, Cuerpas Radicales. Native Alien is a recurring character in my work. They live in my zines, videos, and performances as an extension of my ancestors and my future selves. In this clip from a street performance, I set up on a busy intersection on the Lower East Side. I wanted to challenge myself to perform without sound. These are digital stills for my latest video, Fascist Love, an anti-capitalist, anti-fascist, post-colonial love song, asking, is true love possible under fascism?
If I wasn't living in this constant bureaucratic TikTok, totalitarians and phantoms, picture me scrolling. Have we met before? I'm not sure. Convenience store, metaphor. What I'm looking for is shit. I'm pretending it's you.
Falling in love in a fascist regime ain't as easy as they say. The works I compose interrogate history as we know it, allowing me to put forth my own narrative about performance artists as they cross and conceptualize genres of music, theater, and art as medicine. To inhabit versions of myself that live in my performances is to liberate my ancestors and inspire the future generations of brown radical artists through centering my body at the center of my work. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you, Stefa, and you'll hear more from them as we head into the conversation. But last and never least is Monique Muse Dodd. Monique is a multidisciplinary artist, curator, and DJ from Severn, Maryland, based in Atlanta. Their work centers on the questions, how do you remember and what do you choose to forget? Through the act of remembering, Muse uses their body to map the lived experience of Africans in America. Muse channels trauma to connect with, process, and alchemize pain, both personal and collective, through sound, movement, and film. Muse holds a BA in film production from Howard University and is a 2020 Source Studio Fellow and recipient of the Corina Miel Grant. Muse was a 2019-2020 Leslie-Lohman Museum Artist Fellow and was the 2019 DCAC Curatorial Fellow. Muse has been awarded residencies at the Hambridge Center 2020, the Flux Factory 2017-2018, and the Eros Museum in Denmark in 2018. To see more of Muse's work, please follow them on Instagram at MuseOFire, and I'll put their bio in the chat. Welcome, Muse.
Thank you for that intro, and thank you for joining us. And I want to shout out Leslie-Lohman. I'm very grateful to be in company of Heather and Stefa and the entire cohort. And I'm looking forward to sharing more of my work with you all. Again, my name is Monique Muse Dodd, or DJ Muse of Fire, depending on who you're asking. And I am a multimedia artist and curator who works in the mediums of film, performance, and photography. This presentation is not a survey, but a selection of work that I want to give more attention to. So I was born and raised in Severn, Maryland, and through my research and through kind of my own digging, I found out my family has been here on Turtle Island for the last 7 generations, predominantly in the German coast of Louisiana and the Piedmont area of North Carolina. But unfortunately, that is as far as I've been able to trace. I started my artistic journey looking for a way to piece together holes in my history. This longing for home and for self led me to my first solo exhibition in film, Remnants. I was interested in creating a family myth of my own, weaving together oral histories, family photos, dreams, recipes, and distant memories. I fashioned a film that transcended the boundaries of my physical reality. On the screen right now is a detail shot from my exhibition Remnants, and it includes different personal items that I collected over time, family photos, and things that keep me grounded. As I moved into working for Remnants, it was a very spiritual place. So I needed something to keep me on the physical plane as well. Dream of land, my soul's from. I hear a hand stroke on drum. Shake the delight, go you, rich as the night, Afro. So this clip that you're watching is from my film Remnants, which is a short film that I created, bringing together different pieces in my search for my own family history and finding things along the way, little hints. And I have the word Sankofa at the top of this slide, meaning to go back and fetch it. And more clearly, or in more like, I guess maybe vernacular, is in order to know where you're going, you need to know where you come from. I graduated from Howard University, and the film program, Haile Gerima has such a huge influence on my artistic practice, and his film Sankofa guided my hand in creating this work as well. This is some shots from my installation for Remnants, which premiered in 2018 at the Flux Factory, where I was a resident at the time. Remnants is about remembering, revering, and reimagining our histories, our legacies, like what's important to us. On the left-hand slide, you see the installation shot. I created a living room for, or like a reading room for people who came into the space in order to sit and reflect on like their family history. I am very big on inviting people to question what they believe about themselves, and also to reconnect with their ancestors as well. So some of the pieces, all the pieces are connected to my family in some way. That's in the corner, a lab coat for my grandfather, who was worked in a lab, and like the Black Power chair, the peacock chair, is just kind of like, for me, I was imagining what it would be like to live in the 70s and like what my ancestors were doing at that time. And on the right, we have a tapestry that I had fabricated by Kayla Lockwood, featuring some of my departed ancestors. And I think it's important for me to honor them in the space, because they have paved the way for me to be here. So in everything that I do, whether it be a film shoot or a photo shoot, I always make space for my ancestors.
Not my home, Lord, I'm
You hear about slavery for 400 years? For 400 years, that sounds like a choice. Like, you was there for 400 years and it's all of y'all?
So this is a clip from my film, Origins of Blackness. And with this film, I was in search, again, of an origin story, of a mythology for Black folks in America. And I refuse this notion that Blackness started on a slave ship. And I wanted to connect to a larger genealogy of Blackness and pulling from the collective unconsciousness, these images that we see. I spend a lot of time on the internet, so I'm very influenced by like internet culture, memes, all of that, I think informs how we view Blackness as well. So working on Origins of Blackness, I wanted to pull from that culture as well. And this is a still from Origins of Blackness. In creating this, I wanted to define Blackness outside of whiteness. So in the film, which you can watch on my website, you'll see these dancers struggle with each other, with themselves, and also surveillance. So you can check more of that out on my website. And this is my last piece. And it's entitled, Who Got My Back? A lot of the work that I do features me as a muse, hence the name. I work in self-portraiture as a way to name myself. I think part of being a Black person and a Black non-binary queer person, I have to constantly validate my experience or I'll be gaslit in my own destruction. Zora Neale Hurston said that if I'm silent about my pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. And I refuse that as well. My practice is grounded in the politics of refusal, of bearing the invisible visible and contradicting the norm. White supremacy is not the poison in the water, it is the water. So by existing as a Black queer trans person, I am resisting. Thank you for your time. Again, my name is Muse Dodd. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Muse and Stefa and Heather. We're going to transition now into just a bit of a conversation. And then my hope is that we will also be able to have some questions from our incredible audience. Thank you all again so much for joining us here this evening. And you are an important part of this conversation. So, I guess just to kind of back up a little bit, right? Let's zoom out before we zoom in. We are certainly here tonight, as Stefa reminded us, as misfits in our sort of wayward selfhoods to make music for the revolution. And I'm really loving that as a kind of premise and proposition, as a promise too, and thinking through some of the words that Heather shared, thinking of this question of what it means to write a love letter to Blackness. Heather, can you speak a little bit about your relationship between photography and poetry? Because I see so much of kind of the poetic framing, structure, lyricism as a through line across the three of your practices. And so it's a really ripe and exciting opportunity to start there, perhaps with the relationship between, your visuals and then your words.
Yeah, that's a great question, because when I got in, I started as studying photography first. That's what I majored in. That was like what I got my MFA in. And after grad school, I was feeling, less inspired to do photography. And so I took some classes with some great, amazing teachers, just learning how to look at words differently. And I've always loved writing. And so I started seeing poetry started becoming visual. And the first poem I ever wrote was on the topic of write a poem about how to write a poem. And so the line was, this is how I write a poem. But I took that same line and I changed it. I made it like bigger. I wrote it in cursive. I wrote it really tiny and it just filled up a whole page. And I was like, damn, this is like it's saying so much, but just using one sentence. And so to me, poetry really has opened up. It just plays back and forth with the photography. Like my photography, I feel like says so much visually that it's almost so dense that it has, writing it down in a book really sort of coalesces it in a way. So it's like you get both. When you can't get my message visually, you can definitely get it, narratively. So
Absolutely. I mean, I want to I kind of bridge that with some of what Stefa has kind of touched on in terms of thinking about the sonic, the lyric, right? The ways that those things maybe as well can intervene and disrupt and refuse certain structures that have been taught to us. And I love, Heather, you speaking so sensitively about that genesis point of your learning, right? Realizing actually that in that kind of exercise, which takes a simple form, that there are actually worlds. It is so complex and dense. So Stefa, this is something that reminds me of you kind of speaking in some of our conversations about your study of classical music, noting that, of course, that you've done this now for more than 20 years. But I was really touched by when we spoke, you noting that, and to kind of call your words into the room because they are so beautiful. You noted that I've been singing the words of Dead White Men for so long, I have to take back control of my voice. That as a moment to kind of hold feels really important in this room this evening. And so I'm wondering if you maybe can share with us a little bit about, what that taking back has looked like for you, but also as well to maybe push that a bit further and consider the ways in which looping, specifically as a structure, has allowed for that to have a particular type of resonance.
Yeah, whenever I've said that line before, because I think at times, when people see me in live performance, especially kind of in like, the music scene or, people aren't expecting maybe every time to have to do a little more work and listening to what I'm saying and in the music that I'm performing. And so there is a lot of context there that I've had to create for myself, disassemble for myself, recreate, build back up, and in taking back how I said, taking back my voice, it's allowing myself to write a song about one day wanting to buy my mom a house, and writing a song about my grandmother, and what she went through in her life, even if I didn't know the specifics, even just to allow myself to imagine and to dream, I think is, a way for me to just be like, I'm still here, and we're still here. And in terms of the looping, to take something that can feel so simple, like a melody or one line in the song that I was sharing at the beginning, quiero una casa, I want a home. If you hear that question long enough, I think, well, for me, it was like, what is home? Home is no longer a physical place because I come from a history of displacement and colonization. And so, and again, and this, like, being the children of immigrants, like, we have this relationship with, like, not feeling like we belong anywhere or we belong to any place, and just having to invent that for ourselves. And I think I can do that for myself through my work, and in looping and creating these mantras, almost, it becomes prayer as well. And in that prayer or in that incantation or in that loop, that becomes like, it can feel like manic sometimes, or it can feel like really healing, or both at the same time, like, strangely enough. And I think in living in the loop, and like choosing the things that I'm deciding to like loop into my life, in terms of words and music is really, important to my survival.
I mean, I so appreciate this idea of the loop as being kind of an essential place, a sort of starting place, a womb, if we will. And I'm thinking as well, Muse, of your mentioning Sankofa, the sort of definition of it being kind of to go back and fetch it, right? Which to me really bridges beautifully with this question of the loop. And as well, to the things that we learn within a kind of structural study of poetics. Like, I can think of in my my early education of it, the language of anaphora always being something that comes up in the kind of pushing of this question of the chorus, of the loop, but that Sankofa articulates it for us in the diaspora with even greater clarity and care too. So, I'm wondering, Muse, as we think about this kind of conversation about what wombs we draw from, that you are so clear and I would say lyrical in making the determination that you are refusing this notion that Blackness started on a slave ship, because of course it allows us a more generous and complex history that really we are entitled to, right? And so I'm wondering, you think about these questions of a genesis point, these questions of origin, presenting, different types of imaginations. Can you talk a little bit about, why origins matter and, what that means or what it does in terms of driving a sort of Black imagination through your lens and your work?
Thank you for that question. I believe that origins and knowing where you come from, it gives you a sense of confidence. It gives you a sense of stability and grounding. So when I hear things like Black Americans don't have culture, at first, it's like, for me, it's laughable, because for me, and in general, America's greatest export is Black American culture. So starting from that point, for the refusal of people not recognizing Blackness in its fullness, for me, is laughable. But then it also is harmful, because when you digest that and you're constantly being fed that information or these images that downplay like the greatness of like Blackness, that has an impact on how you show up in the world. And
Absolutely.
yeah. So it's that's the starting point. And I think it's important that we remind ourselves. So even with the looping, like with Remnants, I used a lot of repeating like phrases like "remember who you are," like drawing from Lion King, or like Sankofa, to remind us, because sometimes you need a reminder,
Absolutely. I mean, I am excited by the idea. First, I love Lion King, obviously. Always excellent reference. But, excited by the idea of thinking about what it means to both loop, but also to exist, as what is seen and not seen, the understanding of our history as a kind of complex imagination and reimagination, that absolutely that through the diaspora, we shape and kind of remix and make culture, but also too, we are kind of constantly navigating these questions of visibility and hypervisibility. So, Heather, I'm curious because, you have spoken with such care about abstraction as being a core component of your practice. And I think there's something in the history of abstraction, but also the kind of intersection with a Blackness and a queerness where it does something really ecstatic and incredible. It allows us perhaps to understand differently, what can and cannot be viewed and how we can refuse that actively. Can you talk about, your relationship to shapes and in particular too, think through maybe aloud a little bit about this proposal that you put forward about shapes in themselves being gendered?
Yeah, thank you. I was thinking about shapes, when you put shapes together, you start to gender them, like, oh, a triangle, inverted triangle, starts to look like a female top, and so I just like, I just like this idea that, the shapes are inherently genderless, and that, putting them together in different configurations. And I call the series Lovers, and they're sort of put together as a couple, but you can't tell quite if it's male or if it's female, or you can't gender them. And so when I think about abstraction, I think, when I started working, like my work is abstract. I work with the figure and I abstract it a lot. And the idea behind it for me is that, I am such an amalgamation of everything, it's like I'm Black, I'm tall, and so there's like, and I'm like masculine presenting, so I get like people are very confused by my presence. And so I started to feel like I'm pulling from the culture, my, what I deem as masculine, the feminine parts of myself, my, like, oh, am I, wearing a leather jacket and all black? Is that going to scare someone on the street? So it's like, I really have to curate where I'm going and how I'm looking. And I feel like that's abstract. Like I'm not just allowed to be a little bit of everything without getting judged. And so that really, I'm trying to visualize that in my work a lot. And that's why a handsome woman is like a bunch of triangles and squares and circles, because, the beauty's in there. I just got to learn how to see it. Some
Yeah.
people do.
Yeah, I mean, and I so appreciate the kind of question of like the way to best represent a certain kind of beauty, but also as well where we can see ourselves perhaps in these shapes and in the remix of them too. And when we kind of consider the notion of abstraction as an opportunity, that sometimes that these misalignments, the ways that we are misgendered, misread, how the world is kind of able to process us in relationship to how we bear witness and hold space for one another in terms of allowing ourselves to be self-determined in our own identities. I'm thinking, Stefa, about some of the notes that you have provided about your voice, right, which is this incredible voice. I mean, when it opened up into the room, I was with goosebumps. So it's such a special gift, to have and to be able to share. Super vulnerable and powerful. But you also have spoken about moments where you have been put in the position of having to think through this kind of question of a misalignment between your body and your voice, and that within the tradition of the kind of hierarchy, canonized classical training, right? That actually that kind of misalignment as a perception is something that actually becomes troubled. And for me, I was really appreciating as I listened to your music just what a superpower it is. So I'm curious to think through with you this question of what these misalignments can do that actually can be powerful, and one step beyond that actually can empower us actively.
Yeah, so when we were chatting, I talked about in my training being told that my voice didn't fit my body type, and my voice didn't fit my acting type, because I was a high soprano. And when I opened my mouth, people were shocked that like that voice was coming from me. And that was always really confusing. And to be told like, oh, what you are is wrong. That's not the first time, I heard that, to be like gaslit, by just existing as yourself. And so, as much as that took me a long time to understand, and to take back control of my voice, and to not try to fit my voice into something, not try to sound like someone or someone who has a voice like mine, because I'm like, who is actually deciding those things? And that happened to me in a very traumatic place, which was an English drama school where they were telling me this. And yet in my head, I was like, but I feel, I don't agree. So in that kind of in that gaslighting and in that almost like miscategorization or something, I feel like it's also empowered me, because I'm almost less afraid to take up all this space in my work, because I've already been told that it's wrong or weird or not aligned with what's already there. The structures that are already there, the ideas about voice and body that are already there. So, I kind of have, in a way, had to just say like, screw all of that, because I can't change my voice, or I won't, unless, I want to for some sort of like character reason or something. But, yeah.
I mean, so I think that it is exciting moment to expand that further, because as well, within this question of the voice and the chorus, Stefa, I know that, there is kind of a through line too with some of what Muse has kind of meditated on in terms of their work, asking questions about what a spiritual life can be. And so Muse, I know that you have asked or kind of posed the question of what is the spiritual life of enslaved people, right? But to expand that question even further, because it is such a complex question, the question of what a spiritual life is, period, across the diaspora is a really wonderful question and enriched question, most particularly because, as you've noted, that you really need something more than names in a census, and this idea of how we map make and kind of create certain landscapes as tied to our own origins and identities is something that actually is more somatic, perhaps, as a proposition, and as a result more spiritual. Can you talk a little bit about this question of the spiritual life and maybe how you imagine that or thread it through your work? And I'm going to pose that question actually to each of you, because I do think, Heather, with your Icons series, right, as you think about ways of manifesting a different type of selfhood, and as well maybe a different type of reflection, quite literally thinking about what visibility can be and the way that you can, kind of radicalize that, shift the power dynamics within it. And of course, Stefa, across your work, as you think about ways of engaging Indigenous practice and informing yourself further about those histories, that spiritualism certainly travels through all three. But maybe Muse, I'll start with you.
Yes. With these names of a census, going to ancestry.com and trying to piece together this history, and it also it kind of makes me mad that I'm paying money to learn about these things that were forcibly stripped from me.
Right, they should be ours.
Yeah, should be free. Honestly, in my reparations package for African descendants of the transatlantic slave trade, DNA tests would be free. I want a round trip ticket to a country in Africa of my choosing. That, I think that is the least America can do. And when it comes to thinking of, like you said, I like the word somatic. I'm thinking about getting back into my body and even just thinking about this language of, especially in the art world, we kind of separate Black people from Blackness, and they can exist simultaneously. But I think, especially with the use of the Black body, I am how do we reclaim that with our spirit? Because I think also when you think about enslavement, especially chattel slavery, the thing that you can't control is our mind and our spirit, and how we've been able to tell stories, how we've been able to pass down our traditions. And I grew up in the Black church, and thinking about how those modalities of worship are totally different from a white Protestant church, and we don't necessarily in the Black community, we don't necessarily see that as African per se, but as someone who studied African traditional religions like Ocha or Ifa, you see so many similarities. So I think my work is about connecting the dots and connecting the worlds in between, and following the legacy that has been left from our ancestors, and kind of trying to get more people to tap in to this spiritual history that is already there.
Heather, what about you? I mean, I'm thinking, of course, about your Icon series, but I also think that this may be presence of a certain kind of spiritualism and wisdom too, because I think there's a link between spiritualism and wisdom, that we see within your instructions that you provide, the kind of this question of what it is to create a kit for queer survival, and to have that become something that can exist as a document, a manuscript, a mantra, a hymn, a call to action, right? So there's something there too that feels, really important to slow down and pay attention to.
Yeah, I mean, spiritualism has had such a huge impact on my work. I've really, the more writing the survival guide felt very mediumistic, sort of just it felt super powerful to talk to the 10-year-old, Black girl who was in love and had a girlfriend, and was told that that was shameful. And so I wanted to talk to her because I felt a lot like falling in love and depression, like suicidal depression, felt very similar to me in the sense that like the world becomes different, like the actual, it's like becomes really particulate, like it feels like you're walking through water. And like when you're falling in love, it's like I'm walking on air, and I'm just, like it just changes the world. And when I was suicidally depressed, like I felt the same way, just like so heavy and so like just like I was weighed down, and there was this like just my body had become so solidified, and I felt so just like it was hard to move physically, and all I wanted to do was sleep. And so for me, the saving grace was like, my father recognizing that I wasn't in a good place and that I needed help. And that was like a very spiritual experience to go from, like, okay, you're gay. Well, let's go talk to someone about it. And so I feel like if I had this book as that, 10-year-old, 11-year-old, I would have, like, it just felt like, oh, this is like something special, like, and I write a poem about, growing these angel wings and the itching of that like first desire and not knowing what it is, but knowing that it's not right. And so that was like a spiritual experience, to fall in love and then have that taken away from me. And so the older I get, the more significance I see in that.
I will read the line because it's something that like literally has been in my dreams for the last couple days. I think you quoted it as the discovery of queerness is the itching in the bones and growing angel wings, which I just think is so incredible. And Stefa, I'm thinking of your question: is true love possible under fascism? The kind of supremacies of some of these different systems, as they operate, right? Kind of the question of what our right or obligation is to love and care for and create space for one another, and as well too to be loved, right? Because as a kind of question that the survival kit puts forward, right, is like, do we deserve to be loved? And the answer is resoundingly yes. And that is the thing that I think is really important for all of our kind of kid queer selves. Like that's the messaging that feels really necessary, and to continue to kind of remind ourselves to decolonize some of those modes of thought that tell us otherwise, right? So Stefa, I know that you talk about yourself being a political pop sensation. And that's something that, makes me chuckle because I just love the turn of phrase. I think, it's something, it gives me something to aspire towards. But also too, that I think it creates this really important tension as we think about spiritualism. The pursuit of the individual as a kind of construct of an icon, a pop star, right? But then as well, the collective practice of politic as a kind of spiritual engagement and mantra. So I'm wondering if you maybe, as a kind of through line, as we continue to expand on this question of spiritualism, can also maybe map out for us a little bit about what that has looked like for you, the flattening of those hierarchies and the ways in which maybe you hold space for a collective or choral practice.
Yeah, I was gonna leave political pop sensation on my presentation, but I decided not to. Yeah, but we're here. So I was thinking, because right, these hierarchies, right, and like what does it mean to even call yourself a pop star or aspire to be a pop star, especially like as also like a socialist or an anarchist, where we're trying to dismantle these hierarchies and holding our icons up to some standards that don't exist or that are impossible. And I feel like in my performances, they're like, yes, I'm on a stage, or yes, I'm the energy is centered on what I'm doing and what my band and I are doing, but it's also not like we're leaving the audience off the hook. You know, I think when they're coming into the space and when they're listening, they're confronted with the things that I've been asking myself, and also the things that I'm asking my community and the people that I love around me. You know, is it possible to love each other truthfully? What does it look like to love each other when every notion of love is tied to extraction or capitalism or, you know, or these like false ideals of what it is to exist. And so I don't want to, like, as a performer and as this political pop sensation, it's because I want to have that conversation with the people who I'm sharing my work with, because the energy that I'm giving them, I need them to receive it. And if they're not open to receive it, then I can't give it to them, you know. There is an exchange there happening, and I think it, you know, it requires people to be open and to be vulnerable with themselves. And I think that's what is cool right now. You know, that is what we're trying to aspire to, is like being vulnerable and holding each other accountable, and not just, you know, canceling and each other, but like really trying to heal and build and grow together. And I think, you know, as political artists, or, you know, even though I don't even like, I use that term because I actually don't like it when people are like, oh, you're a political artist. And I'm like, if you're not, then like, I don't know what you're doing. Like, I'm not interested.
Right.
And we don't need, you know, it's complicated, but
I think
I
that that is something that's a rabbit hole worth following. I do think, you know, like I appreciate this question of the political as being urgent and necessary, right? And that actually that, you know, the role of the artist should be embodied in that politic, right? To be thinking critically with rigor and care and vulnerability, all the things that you kind of have outlined. So I actually think it's good to commit to, like, put the pressure on for sure. Because also too, the three of you here tonight are so much an embodiment of that, right? Thinking about ways where that can take different forms and shapes. As some questions come in from the audience, I am, you know, gonna maybe sort of pivot back to thinking a little bit about, you know, Muse, this question of African and then African American. Because I do think that there's something there that, you know, is really sticky and challenging. And at points, people get really up in arms about, most particularly, you know, as a subject that you pursue, thinking about how African-American people can appropriate and at points misappropriate African culture. But I do think there's also something that's really amazing about the fact that you're a DJ, uniquely attuned to the language of the remix. And I do think, you know, when I think about the kind of the what the remix does within an arc of the diaspora is that it allows us to innovate from, you know, something that actually has been radically unfamiliar to us and perhaps even invisible. And so the meaning of that, allowing us to perhaps guess towards a kind of radical innovation and then make something transformative and new, is really incredible. It's a kind of alchemy. So I'm wondering if maybe you can talk about, you know, some of the joys of it, right? Because I think that sometimes in our guessing and actually, you know, at points hitting it on the head, at points getting it wrong, at points fantasizing about it as part of a collective imagination, and then as well moments where we guess and, you know, we sort of fail miserably, right? Like thinking about how these questions of appropriation actually, you know, can be troubling for many reasons. That we see in our day-to-day as tied to our Blackness and queerness. So, you know, what is that tension for you? How do you kind of negotiate that?
Right, it is a tension, and it is something kind of that was an impetus for me. But thinking of like kind of what like I'm dreaming of, and I'm dreaming of Black liberation across the diaspora, and thinking about like intersectionality or like lumping people together that kind of refuses our individualness, and like how can we show up as our whole selves, and the nuances of that, and allowing the space for that for me, and then thinking about in music, when you listen to like a lot of times dancehall music is grouped with like Afrobeat, and like pulling these different things because there's a thread. There, like the rhythmic influences are there. There is something that is like there's a quote by I think Kwame Ture, and it was like, I wasn't born in Africa, but Africa was born in me. And how, and like in my travels, I've spent some time in Salvador, Brazil, and like me going there and listening to the music and like being like, oh, this sounds like go-go music, because I'm from the DMV. So like finding, like we're like, for me, it's like we're the same people, but we have specifics. So even like if you listen to like go-go music, it's going to be different from like Chicago house or footwork music or like bounce music. And you can't, I think it's more of like when you think about remixing, and you have to attribute your source. You can't just rip the music and then try to claim it as your own. There is a lineage there. So I think that is important when we come as an African of the diaspora. It's important to attribute and to know where things are coming. I am not a fan of people who take iconography, like African iconography, without knowing the history of it, and you can be attracted to something, but then I also challenge artists to understand more about it and be curious about it. Instead, by not being curious, you're doing your ancestors a disservice, and and the people, the modern day descendants who are living in this culture and who've been raised in this culture, you're also doing them a disservice as well, and you're like dishonoring them. So I think it's important to study and to understand that. So there's space for all of that. And I think it is a nuanced conversation. It's a larger conversation. But I think the root of it is that we have a lot of work in terms of, and like also liberation can be exciting. It can be joyful. But like the revolution is going to have music. So like finding the music and finding the sounds of the revolution is also exciting for me.
I want to maybe call out some of Stefa's notes, because Stefa basically said, I think if I'm hopefully quoting correctly, I didn't know what the words meant, but I was interested in hearing them in my mouth, as kind of a reflection on sort of, an engagement of the indigenous, right? As we kind of learn parts of our own history and maybe are not fluent in them. So, this question of citing sources is really important. And actually at points too, I think becomes a kind of complex pitfall, because when we guess at things, sometimes we end up recreating them without even realizing, because there are these kind of maybe somatic things we carry with us, the kind of epigenetic questions that are kind of these materials that we maybe are transmitting without even being aware. So I love that bridge that you build about these different sort of geographic sites, but the sonic frequency of them actually is something that is shared. Heather, to pivot a little bit to think about, before we share out some questions from the audience, to think about this idea of representation, because I do think we've touched on that a little bit over the course of the conversation here, but as well, I think it's always useful to spend a little bit more time, and particularly to expand one of your primary questions, which is, why aren't there butch Black women on the walls in museums? But Muse, I see in your work, your space that you are holding for that presence. And so, there is something as a confluence across these different practices, very different, kind of languages that they speak and vernaculars that they draw from, but that actually do a kind of amazing service to one another in thinking about ways where that space can be held institutionally, most specifically, right? So I'm wondering, maybe, Heather, if you can speak a little bit about, what that means in terms of that sort of seeking or journeying in finding oneself or looking for oneself on the walls of museums, because that is something that I think, many folks who are in the room with us this evening can likely relate to and have struggled with, most certainly as Black people and queer people.
Yeah, I mean, I work at a museum, and it's like, you walk through the museum and it's, all the people in the paintings are white, and it sort of becomes like the walls of great, white exceptionalism, and Black and brown people, if they're found, it's like in primitive or tribal or the tools that indigenous cultures use, or we're in the background, of someone's painting. And so, looking at becoming an artist and looking for inspiration to, just wanting to be a part of the story of museum culture. And I think what makes me think about it is, I had this experience with Basquiat, and why I started the After Basquiat series, because that's the first time I saw myself, in the painting. I was like, wow, these men, he's painting look like me. Like, this is the first time I've seen myself. And I just would stare at the picture, his paintings, and just like, feel seen, feel like the sort of the graffiti of it, like the abstractness, like all that I related to. And it's like, and I really was thinking of Muse's answer to the question about, African versus African American, and like, what is our history? What's my history as a Black American? It does, if I don't do my DNA test, I'm lost on the slave ships, and that memory is getting further and further away. So like my, my nearest history is like, oh, sharecroppers, like that's my legacy. There's no like, oh, we're from this part. And so the Black experience is really, like, that's why I think about remixing. And I know I'm going into Muse's territory, because I'm not like a DJ, but it just makes me think, like, when I paint, like, I'm creating a history for myself. I have to create an artistic legacy that's not quite the modern painters, like, we're all different, but I have to like create a legacy. There's no like, someone I can become an apprentice to as a Black American. There's no sort of historical lineage that I can be attached to past, the 70s and the 60s. I'm sure there were more before that. So yeah, I kind of forgot the question I was going off.
No, you're right on the right track. And I'm actually loving the pathway that we're going down, because as you're mentioning this kind of language of apprenticeship, as we see things on museum walls, the way that those things change and transform us are complex, and often are some of our first educators. And so it is really, a kind of amazing thing to be proposing what it means to put, different images on those walls, because they are such an important part of our visual culture, but also the way that maybe challenges the sort of linearity of a Eurocentric history, a linearity of sort of Eurocentric time in particular, and as well definitely proposes that, through this kind of collective practice of doing the work of, allowing these different spaces to be staged differently, different bodies to exist within them in terms of our somatic history, that actually is an inherently queer material and a really important act. So, a question across all three of you that has come in from the audience is to speak about, what does joy mean to you? Because, as we're talking about your work collectively across all three, but also, as each of you speak about your practices, there's light in your face, right? And so, that is something that, is felt in the room this evening. And as, of course, is a driving force to why we, wake up and pursue this creative work and the day to day. So can you talk a little bit about, what is it that brings you joy in this act of making and in this life that we have chosen, which is a complicated life, right? It can be challenging to kind of figure out ways to grapple with these histories and these incredible questions, but a necessary one. I don't know who wants to go first.
I can go. For me, joy is being able to commune with my people, and my people, Black people, creatives, queer folks, trans folks, and talk about things outside of white supremacy, the patriarchy, and our dreams and dreaming, that brings me joy. This conversation is bringing me joy. Like you said, it's hard, especially we're in a pandemic. Like, grab all the joy.
Certainly in a pandemic.
Like, we gotta grab the joy.
Forget. That is now.
Grab the joy that you can get, and then also create that for yourself, and invest. And I think investing in those things that bring you joy. And I think there is an importance in naming ourselves and that episode from Lovecraft Country, the I am. I think I can name myself. I am joyful. I am peace. I am free. I think there is a joy in creating my own path, and like thinking about what Heather was saying in terms of like not having the apprenticeship. I think we are kind of building our path as we're walking it, but also knowing that those who come behind us have a way as they forge their way as well. I think that brings me joy as well.
Heather, Stefa?
Did you want me to go first, Stefa? Okay. Well, I guess for me, like, I've been finding a lot of joy in the quiet moments, like I think the pandemic has really brought me back to center and sort of realized the preciousness of life, and sort of having all this time alone, I really become my own friend. And you saw the cat walking around. It's like, we've kind of super bonded. But so just like I know it sounds so cheesy, but it's like, sunsets and walks on the beach, like that kind of stuff, just really quiet moments. But, doing this work, like after writing the poetry book, it was, that was really triggering to write. I thought it would be a release, but it turned out to actually be a weight, because I was sort of lifting all the stuff to the surface. And I kind of had a really hard time after that, and sort of between writing Survival Guide and I Owe You Nothing. I mean, it's like that sort of survival guide too, because I had to re-empower myself and sort of learn my own agency again, because there was something about writing that book that kind of made me feel not victim-y, but it made me feel very like a walking nerve, like sort of being a Black person, Black queer, and visibly out. There's just something about that can be, I'm just never comfortable. Like, that's how it felt. I was never comfortable. I never felt safe after writing that book, particularly. And there was something about having to learn to love myself again, and to learn to love my queerness again in a new way as an adult. What it's like, I feel so much safer. So it was like a journey. And so now, my joy it's coming much easier and more simply in simple things, I think. Thanks.
Stefa, what about you?
The first thing that comes to mind of where my joy is coming from right now, it's a lot of it's coming from, as painful as it is, also it's healing my baby self, which I feel like that journey has kind of gone into like overdrive in the last 8 months, since being forced to be alone and feeling the depth of that loneliness of not having distractions around, not having 5 jobs to run to, not having my show next week or whatever, having to really just sit with myself, and for the first time not performing, like realizing that most of my life was a performance. When you're going to work, when you have to go to this thing, when you have to go mingle at this thing, and in kind of almost like re-finding myself, really, and thinking about my baby self, and when I felt alone as a child, or when I felt silenced, or you know, and connecting that to where I am right now, I'm finding a lot of empowerment and love and tenderness in caring for that younger version of myself right now. You know, in like wearing whatever I want and you know, doing what I want to my appearance and getting more tattoos and getting more piercings and like and living in this body as so many ways that I've been told I shouldn't, because it's not professional enough, because it's not the, you know, and right now I'm just, you know, I'm finding joy in just like being silly and having fun, and you know, having sleepovers with my very close friends who, because we don't have much else to do, and you know, like yeah, getting joy from this conversation and Heather and Muse and Legacy, and yeah, all my friends in the chat and stuff. So thank you.
Well, I think that, you know, across the three of you, I mean, I keep having to kind of hold my tears back. This is the Cancer in me. You know, the Cancer rising is coming out strong, but thinking about, you know, these questions of, you know, what it means to nurture our inner child, right? And that, you know, as we're here, we are kind of here in stillness. It is really challenging to sometimes sit with our thoughts. But we're here, of course, for the flowers of this incredible fellowship that each of you have, you know, kind of just completed and are looking back on, and for the Basquiat crowns that, you know, we are here to adorn ourselves with, and to bring up that question, you know, again, is true love possible under fascism? I would say yes, right? Most particularly because, as devastating as it might be to kind of stare it in the face, we are living it, right? And holding that space for that love. And we are, you know, Heather, to your words, we are not here to coon, jive, or dip. But if, you know, we are faced with that as a decision, we will refuse it. And most certainly, too, here for that revolution, which feels, you know, really necessary to continue to hold space for and hold sight of. We see that in each of your incredible practices as we are here this evening with each of you, you know, for this culminative project of your work at Leslie-Lohman. And even though I wish that we were in physical space and could go grab a glass of wine afterwards, you know, I do hope that we are going to continue in the conversation, all of the incredible folks who are, you know, in the chat with us. And perhaps we will end on just a last question, something that, you know, has come in from the audience and does seem like a good note to conclude on. What does it mean for each of you to connect with and maintain the relationship to the earth? Quite literally, how do we ground ourselves, right? In a moment, not only a moment like this, because it doesn't necessarily have to be informed by the pandemic, right? But, you know, there is something there about, you know, Muse, your kind of questions about origin points and the language of the womb, you know, where do we come from and how do we kind of begin and maybe begin again? Stefa, you know, your engagement of sort of the indigenous, you know, as something that is inherent to us, right? And a kind of tool to reconnect with, to really discover who we are. And of course, Heather, you know, as we're thinking most particularly about ways in which maybe some of our kind of celestial aspirations, you know, the kind of the fullest self as we are developing, you know, our inner child, but also too kind of looking back and extending a hand to the child that maybe, you know, really needed it in each of us at that time. You know, what does that grounding look like? Maybe what are some intentions, if, you know, if that's easier to kind of look toward as we ground ourselves and conclude in the evening?
I'll say that when I started writing music for myself, that was one thing that I was like, how do I return to a place that doesn't exist? And in one of my songs, Volver, which means to return, you know, I was like returning to feel, returning to think, returning to grow, returning to the land, return to the earth. And how I feel like all those things are connected in in not only our survival, but like our also to be able to thrive, you know, to this idea of like returning to land and what that actually means. And I think it connects to returning to our humanity, you know, in a way. Like what were songs before they were commodified? What were they used for? And they were used in prayer, and they were used to heal, and they were used to tell stories, and they were used to keep these traditions and to keep our literal stories alive. And I'm like, okay, but what if I wasn't given that, you know? And so in trying to return to something, it really does, I think, if we can think about what it means to return and live by the land, it actually requires us to question and dismantle a lot of things that we have been told are true, are the only ways to live, are the only ways to consume, are the only ways to relate to each other, which is a lie. We don't have to. The only way we relate is not by what we consume, is not by what we buy. But really, like the interpersonal relationships in our lives and how we treat one another. And I think how we treat the earth and the land that we inhabit is how we treat the person next to us. And I think, you know, all of that is really inherently connected.
Thank you. Muse, Heather, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a really a question that's been on my mind a lot lately. I just returned, I did a residency in North Georgia, and that was my first time really kind of being in the land and like being in the woods and in a cabin and surrounded by animals and stuff. And I was like, oh, this is different, you know? And I think growing up, I grew up in the suburbs and then like moving to New York, being in the city and like being disconnected, of understanding that these trees and this stream, like those are our cousins, you know, and like we are descendants, and they also make it possible for us to exist here. So I've been given like a new kind of outlook and a new connection to like grounding to this land that I'm currently on. And then also just thinking of how we kind of like mitigate the violence of being torn from a homeland and being torn, and then also the forceful like removal of Indigenous people from their land, and how that had set the scene for this country to exist. I think part of that grounding is to speak, you know, speak on that. And I think to remind ourselves so we don't forget that this land is not, you know, like this land has Indigenous roots, and like we're guests here. I think that has been important in my practice and centering that and grounding that. And then also honoring like my ancestors and how they worked the land. And I visited the Whitney plantation in Louisiana, and like I had family that worked on that plantation. And what is my what is my connection to this land, and how can I honor that? And I think as even if you're not from here, if you are doing the work to learn about the land and listen to it and listen to the people who've been like stewards of the land, we would be in such a better place. And like just like I think it's just like listening. I think there's so many different ways to listen. So that could be in stillness, that can be in meditation. I hug trees, you know, like, so that's
I love hugging trees. Yeah. I mean, for those who have not tried it, it actually really is quite a convening. And it also just makes you chuckle because, you know, they're these incredible creatures that are just living in our midst, and we walk by them, you know? So I do think that there are these different moments where we have to root ourselves and kind of, you know, put our hands on our healing as it exists in the natural world. Heather, what about you?
Well, when I hear that question, I think of like my granddaddy and his shotgun that he used to have on the wall, and you know, peach trees and chickens in our backyard. And you know, it was like, I'm a military kid, so it was, you know, city, like I had cousins who are in New York City and Brooklyn, and I had cousins who were in South Carolina. And so grounding to me as an artist seems like getting closer and closer back to the sharecropper roots and sort of looking at how, as an artist, you know, I have to be grounded to create, you know, that's like part of my practice. And, you
Right.
know, I really try to um, look back at sort of the history of the earth and how that, you know, has really resonated with me. And I did, during the pandemic, I did go out and hug trees because it was like the only contact, the physical contact I was getting.
Oh, can a tree get COVID?
Yeah.
No, I'm involved. I'm involved.
So I was down with it. Yeah. But literally just sitting in the grass and meditating, I like to do that in the mornings, you know, when on the weekends and stuff, I'll just incorporate that into my process. So that was a great question. Thank you.
Well, I have to say, I'm so inspired, and I also love in the chat like hella tree huggers who just are just loving the vibe of just being in the natural world. So I just so appreciate being in such good company because it is the jam. Amazing energy to carry us through this evening. A perfect place to conclude. I wish I could give you all a big, major hug, but you know there will be these virtual hugs, you know, in their place until the time comes. But you know, just celebrating you. So excited for each of you. So honored to be invited. And so thank you for allowing me to kind of guide this space this evening. Thank you to Leslie-Lohman. Thank you to Stamatina and Ella, and to all of you for coming through in the chat, in your tree hugging, in all the positive vibes that you've shared. And yeah, we're really looking forward to continuing the conversation and seeing each of you in the glow up as your practices continue to expand. So have an amazing rest of your evening, all of you, and stay tuned for more. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Legacy.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks all
Yeah,
for
thanks
being
everyone
here.
who came.
I love y'all so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for a really powerful and moving presentation, Legacy and Heather and Stefa and Muse. So much nuance and depth and tree hugging energy. Super awesome. This was a really extraordinary series and an extraordinary way to cap off the series. Congratulations to everyone that has finished this fellowship year, and we're not saying goodbye. You are part of our community and family here at the museum. Thank you, everyone.